And we're live. Welcome everybody to another NPM Open RFC call. Today's date is Wednesday, July 13th, 2022. We'll be following along in the agenda that was posted in issue 613. I'll copy and paste that for folks. And feel free to add yourselves to the meeting notes talks that also was shared in chat. A quick reminder, these calls and all comms on the RFC's repo are covered under a code of conduct. We ask that you please raise your hand if other folks are speaking. And just in general, please be mindful and thoughtful of folks on the call. Quickly, I want to give the floor for any folks that had any announcements. Feel free to speak now. If not, I guess the one announcement we have, I believe, Gar, you just pushed out the latest version of NPM. What version is that?
8.14.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So feel free to go grab the latest, greatest version of the CLI. We are pushing out weekly releases on Wednesdays. So feel free to go check out the latest command. I think was audit signatures just landed in 13.
There were actually a lot of features. The two that the community will be the most excited about, I hope, is the signature audit and my node modules changed event, lifecycle event in scripts. It's called dependencies. So anytime your dependencies change, after they're done changing, this event fires. So you can do whatever you need to do. So that was a big blocker for a lot of people. So that shipped today.
Awesome. Thank you for that. And quickly jumping into the agenda, the first item that was on here is the PR 5000. This is NPM query. Guy, I know you've picked this up, the workup here. I don't think there's much of an update unless you have something you want to share from the last week.
I would like to at least have discussed or brought up the from field here. One of the things required to take the JSON that's given to you and be able to reconstruct the logical tree is to know what required what. And so the latest addition is I've added a from array to all the objects that give the local path is the attribute that's in there, because that's going to be the real, that's an effective unique ID for all these things instead of having you invent a new one that tells you, and from that you can recreate your tree again down the road. That was the minimal thing needed without something we might want to back out of. I felt that was, we can keep that, and if there's something else we also want to do, we can do it in the future. Other than that, it's just about fixing the tests for the case insensitive stuff I added and making sure that the dev prod selectors work like we think they do. So that's where we're at. It's very close.
Can we, I feel like we need to update the RFC with those two things, specifically the case insensitive and sensitive attribute selection, and then the from field being returned, which might round out that doc and we can finally ratify it. Does that sound good? Like I can go take that away as
yeah. I updated the docs in the PR, so you can just steal back from that.
Okay. Did folks have any questions about the from field? Jordan, I saw you potentially. No.
No, I think all of my concerns about it have been addressed by adding the npm explain command. So although that command needs additional features to support like the only prod, only dev stuff and to work without a lock file, the information exists. So it's no longer critical that it be buried in the obscure fields in the reified package JSON.
Cool. Let me just quickly take notes. So quickly moving on then to PR 595. This is proposed backwards compatibility, or sorry, proposed backwards compatible improvements to compression. I believe Evan said he wouldn't be able to make this call again. I believe the last time we spoke on this, we were waiting on an update to get some more data on results of just some testing that he was doing. I don't know if anybody else has any other updates there. Not, we can move on to PR 593, only registry tar balls. I'm not sure if Owen was able to make the call. We had a number of sessions where we've gone back and forth with him. I believe the last update was blocking on NPM query landing to actually do something about this, but I felt like Owen had enough info to go ahead and potentially update his RFC. So I'm not sure what the state of that is. I will add a note here. We have follow-up. And then moving on quickly to PR 591. This is the RFC for registry scope key file cert file credential options by John. I know you're on the call, John. I also saw your PR, I think it was getting reviewed by our team. Or the 2 PRs, 3 PRs. Okay.
Yeah, there's 3 actually. Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah. Let me know. I mean, if you have any questions already about it, just a couple things to call out. Like, there are some things where it is a little different from things like CA file. Like, it's happening further downstream because they're registry scoped. And so, like, back in config in the CLI, I mean, there is that get credentials by URI, which is a little weird because it's like that's used to know if we need to authenticate, but we don't actually use those credentials. And then down in npm registry fetch, it like pulls them out in the same way. So there's some like weird duplication already. So that's why it is the way it is. Another thing to call out is I'm doing like a read file sync because that was the most straightforward way to do it. But if we want to make it async, could totally do that. Just a little more complexity. But also the CA file, the existing one, does a read file sync. So there is a precedent there. But other than that, it's fairly straightforward. But yeah, I'll be curious to hear any feedback or guidance on different things we should do there.
Cool. I appreciate the effort for sure getting those landed as well. So go ahead, Gar.
Thank you.
It's huge. Yeah, some folks usually propose things and never follow up on them. So it's huge to have you propose this and then do the work. So go ahead, Jordan.
About the read file sync, that's actually totally fine. Unless there's something, there'd be an explicit benefit for it, but it might be wise to find an abstraction layer above that where you can make that async forced, like even though it's doing the read file sync, because then that allows, if it becomes an issue later, it could be refactored without impacting consumers of wherever that layer is. But I haven't looked at your diff, so I'll trust your judgment there. Yeah, totally fair. I mean, I think it could be made async without too much difficulty. Just right now, down in npm registry fetch, there's this auth class, and it's done in the constructor. So we can't make it async there. But I mean, it could be deferred a little later. There's like the actual do fetch, which is an async function, and we could like resolve it at that point, and that would be fine. Mm-hmm. So yeah.
Awesome. I don't think there's any updates. Was there any feedback on the RFC itself, or can we just potentially ratify that at the same time I'm making updates? Are we all +1 to just ratify it as is? I'm seeing head nods from Gar. +1s. Okay, great. So expect by next week then, hopefully John will have that landed, at least the RFC, so that's set in stone, and then we can move it to implemented once we land the PRs. So appreciate you pushing through on this.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Cool. Moving on to the next issue that was brought up. There's actually 3 of them. These are the tracking issues for npm v8, v9, and 10. 10, I believe I may kick out of the agenda label from, since it's pretty much over a year away. We can start getting folks' attention to it, but the biggest, biggest reason these are being listed here is just to give some visibility into things left to be done for V8. And as we get ready for V9, what are the breaking changes? So folks may have seen just quick updates to this. A few deprecation warnings go out, and we're going to continue to flag things that potentially are going to be removed in V9 with deprecation warnings. And basically V9, the goal of it is to standardize same defaults is kind of the holistic, mantra, if you will, for the release. The last major release from the CLI was just simply to bump our Node engines as well as our supported Node versions in the engines field, as well as drop the programmatic support for the CLI. So this time it's going to be a little bit different. We're essentially going to be flipping some bits on some configs. But ideally, given the feedback that we've got from Jordan and others, we're going to try our best to obviously land as many features leading up to that release, and continue to ship things in V right up until we can. Our team hasn't got a chance yet to start cutting V9s yet, but there are some things that will take some time for us to actually get done. So there may be a bit of a pause in V8 releases while we're shipping for like a month or so, probably work to V9. So that's essentially a bit of an update there. I'm not sure if folks had any questions, thoughts, comments about the next major. Anything that we might be missing in those lists that you really want to see. If not, we can probably move on. So that was 4947. The update to 564, which is the dependency selector RFC, is just that I'll update it with the changes that Gar has been making. So I'll quickly say that here.
As far as the front field, I'm not sure that the output of the command was ever iterated, because it seemed to me that was pretty fluid when Roy was working on it. It didn't seem like there was a spec there.
Yeah, so we should spec it basically. So whatever is coming out right now, we should potentially at least put it there as a reference point. So
you can look at the top of the command and see how it stringifies it and basically build the spec from that.
Darcy, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Apologize about
Paul's
that.
been very silent for a minute.
Talking to myself. So quickly, the last two issues here that we have, the 1438, which is add libc fields to select optional dependencies should be installed or skipped. This has been brought to our attention again by the folks at Vercel, and was is something that both Yarn and PNPM have supported now for a while. Is definitely something that we can support and I think should support prior to a more holistic approach to distributions or improvements to optional dependencies. The libc field can be interacted upon in a similar manner to the other, and be used kind of in a similar manner to OS, CPU, other kind of platform specific fields that have been introduced. Go ahead, Troy.
So just so I understand, a package that cared about which libc version was used would declare a top level libc field that was a string or an array of strings for like acceptable versions. Is this different than an engine? Like,
it's specific to, it is different than, I would say, engine.
Okay, like I noticed it's not listed in process.versions, for example. So like, nobody would be declaring this in their engines, or like this would be just, so it's like OS and CPU in the sense that NPM implicitly reads it and then uses that to figure out whether the package can work or not.
Exactly. So okay. That's why I likened them to those two fields, because they are also top level fields, not nested in engines that we support and will blow up if.
Are there likely to be more in the future, or is this like the only missing one? Because if there's likely to be more in the future, it might be wise to create a single top level object that can contain OS or CPU and libc and all the future ones, so that you don't have to keep adding top level fields. But if this is the only one, like it's fine, right? Like
it's a bit of precedent at this point as well. And I believe it's one of the last bastions here, but it is a bit of precedent now that Yarn and NPM have supported this, that we're playing a bit of catch up.
So there's already packages published with the field and the data.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So this is
we'd
kind
have
of like our
libc is top level anyway. But I guess the same question is, if there's ever going to be a fourth one, it seems wise to also create an object form so that sets the precedent, so that the next one gets added in the object and not at the top level.
I think
if there's not going to be any more, that's not a concern.
I think at this point, if this is the last, this would be likely the last one that we would support beyond a more holistic approach to conditional optional dependencies. Right. Yeah, improvements to the conditional optional dependencies. Yeah.
Thanks.
No worries. Does anybody else have any questions or thoughts around this? Gar, I saw you on mute. Did you want to?
Just that I looked at the two PRs and for a moment thought we were going to have a node version problem, but that's just an implementation on one of the two. The others use a standard library called detect libc that we can look into to see if we can use that.
Cool. And I believe that that's probably a very small detection lib. So if we had to essentially build our own or write something small to do that. Yeah.
This one supports 8 and above and has no dependencies.
Great. Cool. So if there isn't any other feedback on that, we'll move to the last item, which is PR 165. This is the RFC for a parent package JSON. I know Christian wasn't able to make it on the call. And I'm not sure if they've been able to make it for a while now. I'm not sure if there was any updates here that Wes was going to give. I know he had been a big advocate for this concept, and he said that he was going to give some feedback, which it doesn't look like he's had time to yet. So, yeah, I'm not sure if there's any updates that folks have for this. If not, we can give the floor for folks if there's anything that they want to bubble up that wasn't put on the agenda, any items or discussion topics, as we have a few minutes left here. Oh, thanks, John. So it seems like Owen might be showing up in a couple minutes. Hold back. I'm going to quickly make the note about waiting on Wes's feedback. And I believe the last time we talked about this last item, I believe, Jordan, you had spoken to the fact that this is an area in which like initialization tools and validation of package JSON tools can come in place versus having some sort of extension mechanism or whatever.
Yeah, if it's like, yeah, I guess that's my concern is avoiding any sort of runtime extension of package JSON, using it as a like template tool, so that like, yeah, I mean, so like you can use extends and then you could like generate the full version. I don't know. I just think we have to be really careful about that, because if somebody installs a package, the way it links to the template or the thing it's extending or whatever, there would need to be a way to guarantee that that parent is accessible. And that includes symlinks or copy pastes and things like that. Like, it's actually a very useful property that a package boundary is self-contained in most cases.
Go ahead, Gar.
Yeah, this is a really muddy waters. I don't know how many of you have tried to do this with GitHub. I did not Dependabot, but there's the settings bot. It can actually extend others, but it's not a real relationship to where, like, if the parent one changes, you'll never see those changes in your own. And so having an inheritance is going to introduce the assumption of a kind of relational property between them, and in keeping them in sync is not a trivial matter. And I don't know if the benefits, I don't understand what problems this is solving. I don't think JSON is a relational extendable spec to begin with. And I don't know, I wonder if workspaces or NPM query solve either of the problems being fixed here.
Right. Yeah, I mean, like, I can understand the like reading at the motivation on the RFC. Like, I can understand wanting some concept like dependency groups, where I can say, I want to depend directly on whatever 12 packages and versions this one specifier resolves to. I don't think this is the solution for that, but like, I can see that kind of, because like, if you're in isolated mode and you made a package that's subdependent on those, like, depending on the top one wouldn't give you access necessarily from outside to the transitives, right? And you wouldn't want to make them peer dependencies, because that's a lot of extra tax and stuff. So that would be the only way you'd have to do it, is you make a package that peer depends on all these things, and then you force the peer, but like, that's a lot of extra, that's like more work than just having all the versions the same. So like, and that's just one of the parts in the motivation. So I guess I think it would be helpful to get a really clear breakdown of the use cases to see if this is actually the best solution for each one. And if we figure out the best solution for each one, how do they overlap? Because if the overlap doesn't make this isn't where the direction we'd want to go. And if it does, then there's a compelling reason. Anyway.
Our template OSS repo solves a lot of these problems. The fundamental problem of having a centrally managed, I need to update a lot of things in tandem on all my repos. Template OSS solves almost all of those. The only ones it doesn't solve cleanly is if you have GitHub Actions you need to update, because GitHub Actions can't update GitHub Actions. Outside of that limitation, I think our template OSS approach solves the centrally managed problem.
I mean, certainly it does for NPM, and I haven't dug into it, so I don't know what constraints or like you've probably been able to bake in some assumptions and constraints that are specific to NPM that wouldn't allow template OSS to be a general solution. But I think what it definitely
not the
does,
package, but the approach.
The approach, yeah,
of having a package that Dependabot puts in your repos and then it manages those fields for you. It just works.
Right. Yeah. And so that's what I meant, is that it certainly validates the approach that it can be done outside of NPM. And, you know, I've had visions of similar tooling that I've never gotten around to building for a long time as well. That sort of, unlike the create React app, React scripts approach, that's sort of like a tool that always reifies your package JSON so it looks like the tool doesn't exist. And it like updates the right scripts the right way and so on. Like that to me seems more valuable than something that delegates, because it's more easy to modify it, and it's more easy to see what's being changed as you pull in configuration changes and so on. That's probably an opinionated thing, and maybe some folks disagree, which is why there's like the React scripts or standard type approaches. But I don't know. Either way, I think for the RFC, we need a lot more use case expansion.
Yeah, I think the feedback and general consensus that most folks come to eventually is that like package JSON needs to be static. It's not like a dynamic manifest, right? Like we don't have that concept in the ecosystem, and ecosystems that do have that, like let's say the Swift ecosystem, like have problems with like a dynamic manifest file, which requires you to, you know, actually run code and execute the manifest file to actually interpolate it, and that seems dangerous. That seems like a problem that you know. So I don't know. I feel like this is good. It's a good idea for separate tooling to implement these, and I think there's maybe space for a standard to exist, like a standard tool to exist to help you manage these. I don't know if it's like, I don't know what NPM can do necessarily, like to beyond providing better ways to maybe enforce templates via maybe the PKG like subcommand. Maybe there's a way for us to like allow you to validate, you know, or to apply a template to, you know, workspaces or to a current working directory. And yeah, maybe extends can be like a reference for where that template lives. And PKG would have some sort of understanding to use that and then apply that against it. You know, there's opportunities I think there, but it's not something that's like, yeah.
Well, and I have a comment to that effect, like a few from the bottom on the RFC, that from the last time we discussed this in the RFC call. And like, I think the value of doing that would be standardizing the config file from which that serves as the source of truth for package JSON, and standardizing what can be in that config file, and then having the tooling to reify the package JSON be part of NPM. Like that seems useful to me in the sense that a repo will either ESLint style, it will fail, it will have CI setup that will fail if you don't update your package JSON. And so you have to manually update your package JSON with a command when you update the package JSON source of truth. Or it will work such won't commit a package JSON at all, and it will ephemerally generate one whenever you need to publish or do, you know, run tests or whatever. And in either case, there's a single source of truth and there's a static package JSON for tooling to work with. So if NPM doesn't support anything like that, userland can still do all of those things, but it would be harder to have a coordination on the file path and the format and the schema and so on. And one thing I've seen a lot in the ecosystem is that even when a feature doesn't belong in a core, having the rules and conventions in the core can often help prevent ecosystem fragmentation in advance. That doesn't mean it's worth adding it to NPM. It's just like that would, to me, would be the value proposition.
So the general like keys that we are there's like a known set of keys in the package.json doc that we have today that we respect and that we like know of. But then there's like the idea that you could arbitrarily spec out, you know, like whatever you would want in these templates, which sort of extends beyond, I think, the tooling that we would build. Yeah, I don't know. I think there's opportunity for this to be updated, for this RFC to be updated, and for us to consider something. If Christian, this was open a couple of years ago, if Christian or Wes like get more involved again, I would definitely be open to us building something like this into PKG. I know that this was like, I poked Wes when we introduced that subcommand as like a hope that, you know, he'd get interested since he built a bunch of tooling in this area and potentially bring that back into NPM itself. Yeah, it seems like there's not a lot of work here unless somebody's willing to pick up the mantle to like redesign this. Yeah. I don't see Owen jumping on, so I'm not sure if his conflict has run long. Sure, David, I think we have lots of time. Did you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, let's see. Sorry, this is, I think, the first time I'm here. So hello, I'm David, I'm from Microsoft. Yeah, we recently, I've been talking with Vincent about some of the strict mode or the work that he's been doing to enable that. And we've run into a number of issues with peer dependencies. And peer dependencies, just to give you some context, I started our Fluent component library a long time ago, and I've been working in that space of sort of the middle layer component library, similar to Material UI, where we have React as a peer dependency. And the question often comes up, do we have the component library as peer dependencies of other component libraries that apps build? And peers are always a confusing point for everyone because we don't know whether we should list things as dependencies or peers often. Recently, one of our libraries started adding scheduler as a peer dependency because they thought duplicating scheduler would conflict with the React version of the dependency. And I don't think that's necessarily true, or it might be true in some point in time, or it might not be true. And the real problem is that peers are trying to essentially say, this package is supposed to be a singleton. The problem is that those peer dependencies are happening at the middle layer dependency, like the component libraries. And it's really not necessarily their role to even do that. There's two places where that role matters. There's the application host, because they want to dedupe React. And then there is the library itself, because they know they're a singleton, like they know they have side effects. And so scenario would be like React context. We have a React context package. If you duplicate it many times, it's going to break. It's going to break apps. That's a very, very common case in open source. So really what we want is kind of like a way for both scenarios, the host and the producer, to be able to either declare that they are a singleton or that they want a singleton. And then at the app host layer, there are edge cases where something that might be a singleton might be okay to duplicate because they sandbox scenarios. So in that RFC, what was his Arcanus Mail, who works on Yarn, he gave this really good example where he has a package that self-embeds React. He spins up a Next server and hosts React in his own space. And this is like an example of a sandbox scenario where React can be duplicated, because if my app host uses his package, I might have my own copy of React, but I know it's okay because they're separated. So the proposal in the RFC, I stumbled on it because internally we were saying, without reading the RFC, packages should have a way to just, one, declare what policy they should have, whether the default policy is okay, duplicate it, or that they are intended to be a singleton. And then at the host layer or at the consumer layer, there needs to be a way to say whether they intend for a package to be a singleton or they intend for it to be duplicated. So sort of like a way for them to override the default. And then I ran across this RFC and I started chatting in it. So my thought was a couple of things. One is, if we had this feature, I feel like it would eliminate this constant question of, should I list my dependencies as dependencies or peers? You just listed it as a dependency or not. Those middle layer libraries then wouldn't be the ones responsible for defining whether it's something is a singleton or not. It's either the app host or the producer. Those are the right places to define that relationship or that expectation. So what we're thinking internally is to prototype this and add those relationship definitions in our package JSONs and build some sort of a tool to try it out, to enforce it, that runs on like a post install. So after we've installed, check the policies, make sure everything is A-okay. And if they aren't, then explain why. So that's the other nice thing, is that if you declare things to be singletons or that you expect it, the error messages are way more explicit. They're saying this thing is supposed to be happening one time, and here's where we're violating that expectation. As opposed to like with peer dependencies, it's a little bit arbitrary what the intent is. Sort of, you can kind of say, well, there are unmet expectations, but then you kind of have to have these sort of workarounds to get around it, like resolutions is a common scenario, and then you get into violations that don't quite work. So that's kind of the background on why I'm interested in this particular RFC.
Cool. Jordan, you had your hand up first, and then I think Gar.
Yeah. So everything you're describing is exactly what peer dependencies already do. You are describing accurately an education and intuition and confusion problem caused by the naming and by people's underappreciation of the complexities of dependency graphs. But like, I used to maintain Airbnb's component library, so like I'm very familiar with the exact use case you're talking about. Peer dependencies are basically a hoisted requirement, and at any point in the graph, when they're, as you move up, as they are declared as an explicit dep or dev dep, they're dep, I guess, until you're at the top, that resolves it. And so in Miles' use case, he would put React as a dependency at the top of his little isolated sandboxed graph, and that would satisfy all of the peer dep requirements below it, assuming they're all compatible. And then above that, anything outside of that, you could have another copy of React and it would be perfectly fine, right? So like, that peer dependencies already handle that. And then similarly with the component library approach, other things, when you depend directly on the component library, the React peer dep requirement keeps going hoisted up. So you don't actually have to peer depend on the component library, because the only danger would be if you depended on two different versions of the React component library that's peer dependent on the same version of React, then that would work fine, right? And you'd end up with two duplicate copies of some components. But that's actually like how NPM is supposed to work, because nothing breaks then. You just have a larger bundle than you want. And while I would love for NPM to have a better way to surface possible duplicates in that regard, because it's in that scenario, it is definitely possible to make some changes and reduce your copies of the component library down to one. But maybe your one code path is depending on something that would break with, like you have V1 of the component library and V2 that both use React 17. Overrides doesn't solve that because there must be two copies because they're two different APIs. So the only solution in that case is you have to upgrade them both to V2 or downgrade them both to V1 and change the function calls correspondingly, right? So like in that case, NPM is functioning perfectly as our peer dependencies. It is correctly allowing you to use two incompatible APIs and correctly merging the two peer dep requirements because they're compatible. And the only downside is your bundle size is large, but that's not broken. That's just like larger, right? And so if it does break something because there's state in your component library, then in that case, your component library should be declared as a peer dep everywhere except at the top level app. And then it shakes out the same way as React does, right? And I'd be happy to dig in with specific use cases if you find that doesn't work, because I have a lot of experience starting these things out. The challenge with having the package author try to proscribe how their package is used is that they're wrong sometimes. And Mael is saying, well, yeah, but if they're right most of the time, then the advanced users will figure it out. That has not been the case with like the prefer global one, which is the thing we all have that's been around for a long time. Everyone's like, oh yeah, this is a command line tool, so it's prefer global. And then it turns out that like almost never do you want anything global. And so like if we had a prefer peer or prefer singleton or something similar, like I suspect that that the same confusion would exist just in a different way, because people would be, instead of like underusing peer dependencies because they don't understand, they might be overusing singletons because they don't understand, and that would cause a different set of problems. So I'm like sympathetic to all these completely valid problems and use cases. I'm unconvinced that a new kind of dependency relationship or contract is going to solve it.
Go ahead, Kai.
So the other thing is you still have to declare the peer dependency in a typed environment, because you have to declare only React 5 works with me because 4 is going to send me stuff I don't understand, right? So you can't remove it in the cases where it's being used just because you need to make sure every time I require React, I'm going to get the same one. It's a separate problem. The peer dependencies stay, and they already do solve the problem. It's just a disconnect between things working by coincidence and then people thinking that's the rule in how things are hoisted, and then it breaks when things stop being deduped in the tree. So yeah, it really is an education problem, because there is no way outside of being locked in on your peer dependencies of making sure the right thing gets hoisted to the top. Yeah, it's and again, it's like Jordan said, there could and probably should be better ways for NPM to help you discover and surface that of what's hoisted, what's not, how to find out how many copies of something. So if I require it from here, I'm going to get this copy. If I require it from here, I'm going to get this copy. It really is an education, and declaring that you want to be a singleton is no different than us being just stronger about deduping, because there's going to be points where they still have to declare the peer dependencies because of type problems, and then we haven't fixed anything.
So I'm going to respond. I don't know how to use Zoom, to be honest, really well, and so I can't raise my hand. I'm trying to figure it out. But so the reactions, thank you. I'll try to find it. I'm getting weird video problems here, but all right. The thing that I've run across is there's certainly a learning problem, like you all were kind of alluding to. There's people don't 100% understand or have different understandings of what peer dependencies are actually doing, because they're not. The word peer itself doesn't completely explain what it does. It's I think that's a learning problem, but I think the fundamental there's like 4 problems all rolled into one. One is the first one is like besides the lack of understanding, and by the way, in that scenario, we asked developers, what what peer dependencies are and whether they would use a regular dependency or not. And I've heard people say, well, peer dependencies are where we declare our large ranges. Dependencies are for it's more precise ranges. Like they don't realize that you can have a large range in your dependencies. So that like, there's certainly like misconceptions there, but we have repos where developers don't know what to do with unmet peer dependency warnings. They just have hundreds of them spewing, and there's all these incompatibilities. Another example of a learning problem, and I know there's like flags that we have to turn on peers into errors. So there's some workarounds for that, but I think the real frustration is if I npm save some sort of dependency, I don't know if that dependency can be duplicated. So back to the sort of allusion to React being duplicated on the page, we shouldn't assume that it's safe to duplicate it. I don't think that's a safe assumption, because we've seen in production that's not a safe assumption. When we have certain packages that go window.foo equals bar, and they assume that window.foo equals bar is a particular shape, and you have two different versions assuming a particular shape, then you have singleton problems, things that were intended to be, to have one copy, like CSS libraries, common scenario where, class names are generated. You have two copies, and now you have, and then they use like index-based class generation, and they start at 0, and you have two libraries now colliding with their class names that they generate. And so there are definitely bugs that we've seen as a result of things that expected to live on the page once that didn't. And then the problem is that you either have to have everyone in the graph participate in peer dependencies, or it doesn't work, or it doesn't get enforced. And so you end up with duplication. And I think that's why I'm thinking libraries that are intended to live once in the graph should be able to declare some metadata that says I'm intended to live once in the graph. And then middle layer libraries don't need to make the choice. Is it safe for React to live multiple copies in the dependency graph or not? Or styled components, or whatever happens to be. But their assumptions are never going to be 100% correct. There are edge cases where React can live 3 copies in the same depth graph. That's totally fine, but you have to be very, very intentional. Like, you have to know that those are sandbox scenarios that are not going to share context. You're not going to be pulling some context object from one instance and then assuming it to be the same one in another. So yeah, that's.
Jordan, go ahead, and then I have one follow-up as well.
So I had a few things. First, the reason you're having all those errors is because until NPM 7, nobody realized that they were having invalid dependency graphs. Starting in like 2016, I ran npm ls in CI on all Airbnb projects, internal and external, and it exposed legion dependency errors. Our dependency graphs were invalid like a dozen different ways. Resolving those is a manual problem that still needs to happen now. Even if you're on npm 6, you can run npm ls, and if that doesn't succeed, your graph's invalid. You shouldn't be able to rely on anything working, and nothing matters until you fix that. So like, the new errors that are in npm 7 and 8 are going to be painful for people with an existing application for a while, because it is exposing the fundamental brokenness in their dependency graph that has likely existed for years that they've been completely ignoring. That sucks for everyone involved, but once it's resolved, it will stay resolved and everything will work better. The next thing was another thing that has to be enforced in the entire dependency graph or it doesn't work is semver. It works really well, even though that's the requirement, because people know that it's better. And then the third case is the things that have to be a singleton are the edge case. It's a very small number of packages. Like, there's a reason that JavaScript as an ecosystem stays away from mutation and statefulness, because those things are terrible and they should be the edge cases. And that's why, like, React has to be a pure dep because it has to hold state, but virtually nothing else in the React ecosystem should be, because it doesn't. And similarly, in the ESLint ecosystem, ESLint core has to, be a pure dep because its plugins, have to interoperate. But and there's a little bit of state there as well. But individual ESLint plugins, I don't know. The ESLint's probably a bad example because they have to interoperate with a static config file, and so every ESLint plugin has to be a pure dep. But I don't know, Babel's probably a better example where the core has to be a pure dep and nothing else does, and it works just fine. It's certainly an edge case to have two different React trees on your web page, but it also works perfectly fine and nothing gets broken as long as there's no crosstalk between the two React trees. And that, I admit, that can get tricky, which is why most modern apps are for React are built from scratch as one tree instead of people trying to patch smaller trees into an existing legacy app. But I don't know, it would be interesting to play around with the concept of, if you pretended that all of the well-known pure deps had this metadata, what would it make it easier to surface and explain to people how to fix the existing pile of garbage fire that is most people's dependency graphs? If so, that alone might mean it has enough value to do something. Because it is very painful for a lot of people to get their dep graph into shape. But once those errors don't exist, I don't think there's any added value on top of pure deps to be had. Once the errors are resolved.
Go ahead, Gar, and then I'll hopefully also.
I agree with Jordan that typically a package author isn't always right about declaring that, but I think an app designer should be. And is it possible we instead give the app designer a way to say, I should only have one React in my tree? And then NPM's like, you don't, I'm not going to install, or I do. So it's a contract that you just say, hey, NPM, make sure that everything that requires React is going to get the same one. And if it doesn't, I need to see that as an error. And that could be a way to as an app designer, I don't have to worry about that. People still could, if it's working for them now with two Reacts, that's fine. If they know they need one, they're the ones who know that, and they can put it in their app versus the dependency. Is that a path we could see going down to help people?
I see David nodding a lot, and I just want to get a clarification, Gar, if I could jump in. Are you proposing something that, like a dev-only lock file, would only affect the current project, and even if it was in package JSON, it would never matter that metadata was in your node modules? It would only be for the current app, essentially. Because I'm wondering then. Go ahead.
Sorry. Only if you're NPM installing in that package.
Right. So I'm wondering if, for example, I have a package where I am collecting a bunch of packages so this is ES shims, right? So I have 100 and some individual packages, and they all transitively depend on some similar utilities. And I'm trying to make a mega package that includes them all, and I'm trying to minimize duplications. Is this the sort of thing that I could also say, I don't want duplicates of these transitive deps and have it error, but that wouldn't affect any of the downstream usage? Then that would obviously work just as well for a full-on website that was saying I only want one copy of React. That seems like an interesting direction.
Yeah, that I put a little JSON blob in there, but something that would allow you at the app host layer to say, I expect one thing of MUI or whatever it is to be there, or React, because then it doesn't matter in the middle tier layers whether or not they use peers. It would just be enforced. And then when it's violated, then the tool fails. And like you said, it actually, I think we would have enough data or enough understanding to give a reasonable error message that would tell you how to resolve it. That's always where we get stuck, is okay, some error happened and we introduced a dupe, and where did it get introduced? And having this sort of like a way to define this policy would allow us to say, you said that you expected this, but now we have that as a result of this pull request, or this install when we upgraded something. And so what we were thinking was to build some sort of tool like that and play with the error messaging to see what could we do to make it really straightforward with this sort of policy metadata for you to be able to resolve these kinds of problems and to catch them when they're introduced. So that's what was really interesting to me, for sure.
We only have a couple of minutes left here. I just made a note. This sounds very similar to conversations we've been having in other RFC calls in the month leading up to this one, actually. So improvements to audit have actually been floated a few times, including what kind of other checks could people have that could expand sort of the scope of audit. And we keep going back to the fact that we're introducing NPM query soon, which is going to be this robust selector, dependency selector syntax that allows you to create at least the selector that you could apply to policies, let's say, similar to what you're saying, like that could become the thing that that you then pass to an audit that checks for specific, numbers of results from that query, right? So if you pass a query to, let's say, NPM audit for a specific check, it would check to make sure that you only have one version, one copy of each one of those, dependencies being returned, and then fail if otherwise. But it seems like this is definitely something we want to keep on the radar. I actually added the agenda label here because I know that we're probably going to run right up to time here. So definitely would be willing to talk about this again, David, if you're willing to join us again next week and talk a bit more about what we could be doing in this space. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I see Jordan and Garth both said same things. So our audit subtypes makes a ton of sense. Yeah. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for jumping on today. I know we basically ran right to time, and David, thank you so much for bringing up the singleton issue. I didn't realize it had so much traction in the last little bit. So thanks for flagging that, and we'll make sure that we talk about it next week as well. Feel free to keep going and giving feedback in the RFCs themselves and discussions, and we'll hopefully see you next week. Cheers.